here. My name's Tom Butterworth. I'm going to be taking you through this webinar today. We are going to be talking about establishing a framework of green infrastructure in Greater Manchester, but just a couple of housekeeping things first of all. We are recording this webinar, so just to be aware of that. The slides are already in the handout section, so you'll be able to download them while you're on the webinar from the handout section. And we're going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers. So please do add your questions to the Q&A box, and you'll be able to, those will come straight to us, and we'll be able to pick up and respond to those towards the end. I think that's all the housekeeping. So my name's Tom Butterworth, as I've already said. I'm a technical director in WSP, and I oversee our work on biodiversity and natural capital, and I'm a deputy head for our ecology team here in the UK. And I'm delighted to be joined by Laura. I'm going to pass to you, Laura, to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm Laura Homfray, and I'm a senior consultant who sits within Tom's team, and I specialise in green infrastructure, natural capital and biodiversity assessments, and I'm based in Manchester. So I was really happy to be part of this work. Can't wait to share it with you.
Very good. So we're going to turn off our videos and get into the detail. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, please, Laura. So what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, we're just going to give an outline of how we view green infrastructure, what we think of it as within the UK context. We're then going to move on to some of the standards and principles that Natural England are setting on green infrastructure. Now, Natural England is the government's advisory body on the natural environment and covering England, so their view is significant. Then we're going to move into green infrastructure and some of the work that's been going on in Greater Manchester, and then into our specific project. That's why I'm going to pass over to Laura, who's going to tell us about some of the highlights, innovations, challenges, and takeaways. And then we'll have a chance for Q&A. So next slide, please. So first of all, I think just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, the way that we define green infrastructure within the UK, and this is specifically within England, this is the National Planning Policy Framework that covers England, and it defines green infrastructure as a multifunctional green and blue spaces and other natural features, urban and rural, capable of delivering a wide range of environmental, economic, health and well-being benefits. And those benefits are, yes, for nature, for climate, for local and wider communities, and for our economy, for prosperity as well. Let's move on, please. Within WSP, we like to frame that or think of that as something slightly more. We think of green infrastructure as the ecosystems within which we build our towns and cities. So looking at the river ecosystems, the forest ecosystems, and thinking about how the places we create are situated within those ecosystems. Next slide, please. We also like to think of green infrastructure as something that we build our towns and cities with, whether that be green walls, roofs, parks, green spaces, and so on. Next slide, please. And one of the key aspects of green infrastructure is its multifunctional use. So making sure that it's able to be used for a range of benefits, whether that be flood storage, walking, cycling, transport, for wildlife, for open space, and so on. Bringing that all together in these places starts to make them really important and vital parts of our infrastructure. Let's move on, please. This is reflected within the green infrastructure standards that are currently in development. So Natural England, with other partners, are currently developing these standards in collaboration with a whole group of people. And this is very much a draft, but I think it's a really useful starting point for thinking about our green infrastructure. If we move on to the next slide. There are two key aspects I want to bring out of this, rather than go into the detail of all of these, this process diagram that we have here. And the two key aspects are, firstly, the principles, and under that, this is this first red box we've got highlighted. We've got engagement and multifunctionality. We've just talked about that as an important aspect within our green infrastructure. We've also got things like making sure it's well designed, maintained and managed into the long term, multiple benefits, that it meets local people's needs and supports people's health and well-being. That goes alongside delivering benefits for biodiversity, delivering resilience for climate change, and that leads into the outcomes, which is the second red circled rectangle. And those outcomes make sure that what we try to deliver is inclusive, equitable places that are available for everybody, that they support health and well-being benefits for all of the people living in and around those areas, that it increases the resilience of those places to things like climate change and other changes to our environment, as well as supporting fantastic biodiversity and nature, places for nature. So that's the framework we're working in from a national level, and the framework that we were trying to explore and test within this work and see how we could make sure that that was delivered. If we move on, please. It's really important to say that this work wasn't done in isolation by any means. There is an absolute huge wealth of information in Greater Manchester on green infrastructure already. These are just two of the pieces of work, but there's a whole range of people working on this, but Krista Patrick in the Combined Authority is one of the leading lights here. But we've got this report from, you can see, from Natural England and TEP with the towards a green infrastructure framework, and then this map here which identifies the green spaces that are already there and some of the services that are already able to provide. So it's looking at those benefits we might get, whether it be flood risk management, improvements of air quality and so on, that can be mapped to where the green infrastructure is at the moment. So some really fantastic work, and we were building on the top of that to ask, well, how do we identify where green infrastructure is most needed? But at this point, I'm going to pass over to Laura to introduce our project and say a little bit more about the work we did. Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Just move on to the next slide. So essentially, we were commissioned by Greater Manchester Combined Authority and also supported by Natural England. And we were focusing on three key things that I've set out on the slide. So the first piece, which is highlighted in a red box, because we're going to be focusing mostly on this piece today within the short time we have during this webinar, was to undertake a mapping exercise that set out mapped the community needs for green infrastructure all across Greater Manchester. We also wanted this information to inform the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, and we also provided some guidance to Greater Manchester, which they could then work internally with local authorities to provide guidance for them to embed the green infrastructure approach into the local planning system. So in terms of some of the key highlights, there are sort of three key outputs to this project then. So the needs assessment, which I'll come on into a bit more depth in a moment. The policy narrative, so that was the development of a policy narrative which sort of explained the relationships and the interdependencies of the related strands within the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework environmental policy, which included things like looking at biodiversity, ecological networks, biodiversity net gain, ecosystem services and natural capital. And within that narrative, we included some recommendations for the future development of green infrastructure standards within the Combined Authority. And we also developed a roadmap. So this was more of a policy development roadmap for the incorporation and application of Greater Manchester's Green Infrastructure Standards framework into things like district local plans and other local strategies or allocations that are within that combined authority level. So back to the needs map then. So we actually produced 9 different green infrastructure needs maps. So this mapping was undertaken and weighted by population density to identify community needs for a range of these benefits that include things like cooling or heat reduction within the combined authority, decreasing surface water flood risk, air quality improvements, aesthetic experience, recreation opportunities within 300 metres of the home, and also health and well-being. So we, as part of this project, we explored how the green infrastructure standards that Tom spoke about earlier could be embedded within policy and engaged widely with stakeholders, including the local authorities, the combined authority, of course, and with Natural England. I'm going to pass back to Tom to talk a little bit about the key challenges that we faced on the project.
Thank you, Laura. So yes, this may seem like a luxury challenge, but there was a huge amount, and there is a huge amount of data already available. We've got an awful lot of national data from the Office of National Statistics, Index of Multiple Deprivation. We've also got a huge amount of data locally, including fantastic work on green infrastructure from, for example, the City of Manchester, which is within Greater Manchester. So that working through all of that was a significant challenge in its own right. But the challenge that I think I want to bring out more strongly, perhaps, or focus on a little, is the relationship between where the green infrastructure might be placed, the benefits we're trying to deliver, and where the beneficiaries are. And this is really, really crucial in how we start to map needs. So one place in my picture here, one place could be providing allotments for people to grow food. It could be providing carbon storage. It could also be providing benefits for people in terms of a recreational space and potentially for wildlife as well. Now, the challenge here is that where these things are provided and the beneficiaries may not be in the same place. The example number 2 on the right-hand side, we've got something that looks more like a park in the middle, and the beneficiaries are those that have access to the park, perhaps by walking to it. But for something like water management of flood risk, it may be about where the green infrastructure is in relation to the beneficiaries downstream, rather like 3, or perhaps from a watershed like in 4. There are, of course, situations where the beneficiaries and the provision of the services are exactly in the same place. Interestingly, carbon, of course, is one where the storage could be anywhere we're creating green space that's absorbing and sequestering carbon, and the beneficiaries are all of us globally, and that differentiates depending on where you are in the world and what the risks are from climate change in your area, but the impact is global. And for this reason, we didn't map certain services. So we chose not to look at flood management from rivers. And that was because within this study, there's also already a lot of work done on that from the Environment Agency within the UK. But also within this study, we focused on surface water runoff because the impacts or the and beneficiaries of putting in green infrastructure for flood risk is a complex piece of work, something we are looking at now, but we didn't look at in this study. Carbon sequestration we didn't map here. We already know where the good places are to plant trees. There's a woodland tree strategy for Greater Manchester, which is very good, and we know where our peatlands are, so focusing on those areas is already understood. And biodiversity recovery, we didn't map that because there's ongoing work already on mapping and identifying key areas for biodiversity, so we would just be doubling up. But other than that, so we put those to one side, but otherwise we looked at a whole range of services. And that's why I'm going to pass back to Laura to tell us about those and show us some of the maps.
Thanks, Tom. So here is one of the 9 maps that we produced. So the map that you can see on the screen here is actually showing the need for a reduction in flood risk from surface water runoff through green infrastructure. So this was identified using the Environment Agency's National Risk of Flooding from Surface Water data. So the percentage of each of the output areas, which was in our case an output area was a few hundred households, the percentage of each of the output areas at risk of a 1 in 100-year surface water flood event has been calculated, and then it's been converted into a 1 to 10 scale. So in other words, what that actually means is that a score of 4 for a particular output area would mean that 40% of that area is at risk of a 1 in 100-year surface water flood event, whereas a score of 1 would mean that only 10% of that output area is at risk. So none of the output areas within the combined authority exceeded 58% of their land area being at risk of flooding. So the highest score here is actually 6 rather than 10. The flood risk data was then weighted by population data by adding the 2 scores for each output area together and dividing by 2 to get a weighted score. To provide a bit of context about the population here in Greater Manchester, it's about 2.8 million people live within this region. So the scale on this map that we can see is actually 1 to 5, because none of the output areas actually had a population weighted flood risk score of more than 5. The darker the shade of blue on the map means the higher the risk of surface water flooding. So our next figure here, this one looks at recreation opportunities from accessible green space within 300 metres of home. So the need for the provision of accessible green space for the population in Greater Manchester has been identified using Greater Manchester's Accessible Natural Green Space data set, so that's sometimes known as ANGST. It was decided to use only the data that related to areas deficient in the standard 2 hectares of green space within 300 metres of the home, because this better reflects local community need, and it means that residents don't need to actually drive to the area of green space. Areas here have been scored from 1 to 10 to reflect the percentage of each area that's lacking accessible recreation opportunities. A score of 1 here represents the highest level of accessible green space, and a score of 10 is therefore the lowest level of accessible green space. The recreation opportunities data has then been weighted once again by population, and it's the population weighted score that you can see on the map. So red areas here represent areas that are in the greatest need of new or enhanced green infrastructure to improve those recreation opportunities. Our next figure then, so this one focuses on the health and well-being scores of green spaces. So the need for green spaces which can support mental and physical health has been identified using the health deprivation and disability domain, which comes from the National Index of Multiple Deprivation. We used the 2015 data set because that was the most recent data available at the time when we were doing this work. A score of 1 here represents the lowest level of health deprivation, and a score of 10 represents the highest level of health deprivation. So the deprivation data has once again been weighted by population, and you can see the population weighted data on the map. So red areas here represent areas that need the most or more enhanced green infrastructure to improve health and well-being benefits. Unsurprisingly, these are often those areas that are closer to the centre rather than the more rural areas, for instance, up here in the northeast. And our final map then, so this map is actually a combination in a way of all of the 9 maps that we've done. So it's a heat map of the output areas with the lowest to highest community environmental issues. So the areas that are least in need of new green infrastructure for a variety of reasons, which includes the 3 maps that we've just shown, would be the areas that are shown in blue, and the areas that most need green infrastructure to combat environmental issues would be in red. So the red, orange and yellow output areas are essentially those that would benefit the most from new or enhanced green infrastructure to address a variety of problems such as surface water flood risk or health and well-being. We also think it's important to set out the work that we're doing in terms of the global agenda. So if for those of you who aren't familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, these are 17 goals that have been set by the United Nations to help transform our world to ensure that development is sustainable. So we think that the project's contribution helped achieve goal number 3, so good health and well-being. Number 10, which is reducing inequalities in terms of potentially improving equality to, access to green spaces. Certainly number 11, which focuses on sustainable cities and communities. Number 13, which is around climate action, and number 15, life on land, because of the biodiversity benefits that more green infrastructure could bring. And on that note, I'd like to pass over to Tom, who can pass on his key takeaways from the project.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I should say thank you to Martin Moss as well for a lot of these pictures, including this one on this slide. Fantastic images of some of the vibrant green infrastructure in Manchester. You may just be able to read that. It says "man." That's start of a nice piece of graffiti saying Manchester. So key takeaways. Strategic assessment, and this assessment of needs provides a huge resource and provides incredible maps that allow us to then identify how we can use green infrastructure to make sure that we're creating resilient places for our communities. This, we think, is a really valuable tool alongside the maps of existing green infrastructure and the benefits it's providing, the maps of where biodiversity might be and could be, to bring together an understanding of how we can transform our cities and make sure that they're ready for the future ready. That's the aim of this work, and it feels like it's a really valuable resource to be able to pick up and run with, and hopefully use at within every local authority. There are 10 local authorities, and as well as within the combined authority itself. So I think we're going to pause there and then open this up for questions. I wonder what we've got through on the chat or in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Tom and Laura, for a fantastic presentation. So just again, the housekeeping items, please log your questions in the question box. And also you can download the PDF version of the presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. I will start with the first question. What is the relationship between nature-based solutions and green infrastructure?
That's a lovely question. Laura, I don't know whether you want to talk to that at all, or?
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer that one. So green infrastructure is one form essentially of a nature-based solution. But if you're thinking of green infrastructure as being, it could be trees, it could be, well, what was I going to say? Green roofs, it could be green walls, it could be all sorts of things really. It's just a way in which natural solutions can help produce these benefits for us. So a nature-based solution could be something like a green roof, but essentially the two things are one and the same in my eyes.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think very often we think of nature-based solutions as a solution to a specific issue sometimes, or the very specific intervention that we might put in for those solutions, like sustainable urban drainage, like the green roofs Laura's talking about. Green infrastructure is often thought about strategically across a whole network of sites to deliver those benefits as well. But as Laura says, I think very often they're used interchangeably or at two ends of a spectrum. And we should be thinking about green infrastructure as providing those solutions for us wherever we are. I think that's really important.
Thanks, that was very eloquent. Much more eloquent than I managed.
Thank you. What are the biggest drivers for developers to include green infrastructure within their projects?
So shall I start this one, Laura, and then you can jump in if you'd like. It's a really good question, and we have a lot of policy requirements already within the UK. Now, those policy requirements may not be specifically for green infrastructure, but we do have policy requirements, whether it be nationally or locally, so either within this national planning policy framework that runs across the whole of England, or at a local authority level, or at the Greater Manchester level for that matter. At any of these levels, there are requirements very often for accessible green space, the amount of accessible green space in an area, especially for larger developments. There'll also be requirements to make sure that we don't increase flood risk from the housing development, that we're not causing other risks, whether it be fluvial or pluvial flooding, but also looking at how we're impacting air quality. And very soon, there'll be a requirement under the Environment Bill to deliver biodiversity net gain, so a gains for biodiversity from a development within England. Now, each of those measures may not be specifically around green infrastructure, but each of them can be delivered by using green infrastructure. So I think what's really important is that the developer with their consultants can work together to identify solutions to the issues around flood risk, to the issues around dealing with the heat island effect, or perhaps storing carbon in ways that use green infrastructure, so that you get win-win-win, so that they put their money into one place and it delivers these multiple benefits. That's the real boon from delivering green infrastructure. That's the real thing that I think developers get very excited and interested in.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Laura.
I would just say that we're seeing that the onus more and more is actually falling on developers now to create that green infrastructure, and they're getting push internally as well as just from, say, local councils to deliver on those green infrastructure needs. For instance, Highways England, Network Rail, and others have their own policies that set out that they need to deliver, for instance, biodiversity net gain.
It's a very good point.
Thank you. The next question is about EVs. It says, with EVs set to increase significantly in the next decade or so, EV forecourts are likely to increase in popularity. Are there any plans to incorporate green infrastructure into these future forecourts? And if so, how will it be delivered?
I'm not sure I understand what's meant by EVs there.
Forecourts.
As in forecourts?
Electric vehicles?
Yes, electric vehicle forecourts.
Sorry, yeah. I understand. I'm behind with my acronyms. I think that's a really important question in the sense that we're going to see our urban places change. I think it's certainly within the UK, and I think this is true across Europe, most of the cities we're trying to live in are cities that have been there for a very long time, and we need to help them adapt and shift so that they do become future ready. Every time there's a change, whether it be a new development or something like putting in places for charging for electric vehicles, there's an opportunity to do that in a way that provides multiple benefits using green infrastructure, whether that's putting in trees or hedges or sustainable urban drainage or areas of grassed areas that you might be able to drive over. There's lots of different opportunities there. And we're starting to see some really innovative ones as well that allow for areas that are protecting cars from along highways using green space because they're better than some of the other opportunities to make sure that people stay in the right place and driving safely and so on, using green infrastructure to manage traffic rather than just lots of bollards or bumps in the road, using planters to manage traffic. All of that can be part of our streetscape, including places where we're charging our vehicles. I think that's really important. So yes, huge opportunity every time we change anything in our cities, and we've got to do it in our existing places.
Thank you.
Existing cities.
Next question is, what is the best way to ensure the longevity of green infrastructure? For example, top-down or bottom-up approaches?
Yeah. Laura, do you want to start that one? Well,
I think of an answer. I think that's quite a tricky question. I personally would probably say I'm quite an advocate of the bottom bottom up. Did you say top down or bottom up? Of the bottom up approaches, purely because you get such fantastic stories that you hear about the community getting involved on the ground and creating lovely wildlife gardens together, which not only benefits their mental health but also makes a great place to live. I think one of the most interesting ones I've heard, it might have been in Bristol actually, but it was people who were growing their own sort of herbs. There was a sort of community garden where people were free to take the herbs from the space, which I thought was really interesting. So I personally say I quite like bottom up, but without the guidance there from a top level, I'm not sure how all these smaller projects would happen. So Tom, why don't you expand on that?
Well, I was just going to say, it sounds like sitting on the fence, but I don't mean it to be. I think we need both, and I think it's really crucial that we have both. We've got to have the large projects that have to deliver biodiversity net gain, getting that biodiversity into local places and local communities where that funding can come through from, say, an infrastructure project. We've got to have the policy and the legislation in place. But those bottom-up approaches are really crucial. And one example is something that we were looking at a while ago with a large infrastructure project paying for delivery of green infrastructure locally. The model we were looking at is that what we wanted to do is work with the local authority. And this has actually been done in Clapton Park Estate in London. It's one of my favorite examples. John Little has been working there. Fantastic project where he went out and took over the pesticide license and the cutting license from the local authority. And instead of cutting and spraying, he started growing wildflowers along the edges. This is a housing estate in the middle of London, growing places for people to grow their own food. And he got more complaints from the local community than any other part of the green infrastructure work in that part of London to start with. And then he was working with that local community to understand what they want and what they need in terms of those green spaces, what's really going to engage them. And now that's completely transformed the whole area, but also the community's engagement with that place. So that it really is there so that they're growing the things that they want to grow in order to create a fantastic place that they can be very proud of. So I think we've got to have both, but what I'd really like to see is some of those large top-down projects paying for bottom-up initiatives. There we go.
Thank you. I will take the last question. Thank you. I will take the last question just due to the time. Meaningful scale carbon storage is a big challenge in dense urban areas. What solutions were proposed besides green roofs? Yeah,
another lovely question. Tying together the needs for green infrastructure and biodiversity and carbon is really important. Our focus was around, in terms of climate change, was around making sure that those places are resilient to change. And that means dealing with flood risk, dealing with cooling and heating and so on. But we chose not to look at carbon storage for the reason I suggested in the talk. The key point here is that actually in the urban area, the way we're going to meet our carbon targets primarily is through changing how we use energy, is through ground source heat pumps, electric vehicles, all of that good stuff. You know, solar panels all over our roofs. Yes, they can be green roofs and with solar panels, and we'll get better energy production and better green roofs if we do that right. But the primary change has got to be to that energy use and energy infrastructure. And only once we've done that can we then start really using green spaces to deal with carbon storage, because there's not enough green space, certainly within the UK, to absorb all of the carbon we need. We've got to do that transition. Having said that, once we've done that, planting trees, dealing with Manchester is surrounded by or got some really important areas of peatland on the periphery, and looking after those and making sure that they're wet and that they're still holding the peat, making sure that the trees are planted in the right place. That's absolutely really crucial, but it's going to be a tiny piece of our carbon budget compared to changing our energy use and energy infrastructure.
Thank you. So we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with the team here via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Laura and Tom, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Great to be here.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thanks
you,
all.
everyone.